war was over. The city of Troy had fallen, its walls burned, its defenders gone. For 10 long years, this was the moment everyone fought for. Victory, survival, the right to go home. And yet, something was wrong. Because when the war ended, many of the survivors did not rush back to their homes. Some wandered for years. Some never returned at all. Not because they were lost, but because returning was no longer simple. War had given them purpose. Clear enemies, clear rules. But peace offered none of that. Home was quiet. Home demanded answers. Home demanded responsibility. And for men who had lived too long inside war, that was terrifying. So the question is not why they struggled to return. The real question is this: why, after Troy fell, did no one truly want to go home? For 10 years, war was not an event. It was a way of life. Every morning began the same way, with orders, with weapons, with purpose. In Troy, a man did not have to ask who he was. He was a warrior, a brother in arms, a part of something larger than himself. War gave structure, clear enemies, clear rules, clear meaning. Even fear had a place. Even death made sense. But when the war ended, that structure disappeared overnight. The armor came off. The commands fell silent. And with them, so did the identity. Because without war, many of these men no longer knew what they were supposed to be. At home, there were no battle lines, no shared purpose, no simple measure of worth. Only choices, responsibilities, and the quiet weight of memory. For those who had lived too long inside war, peace did not feel like freedom. It felt like standing alone, without a role, without direction, and without the version of themselves they had learned to survive as. And so for many, the war did not truly end at Troy. It simply followed them wherever they went next. In war, nothing was ambiguous. Every action was justified by survival. If a village burned, it was strategy. If lives were lost, it was sacrifice. War removed doubt. It replaced morality with necessity. And over time, men learned to live inside that simplicity. They learned when to move, when to strike, when to obey. They learned that hesitation meant death, and certainty meant survival. This was not cruelty. It was adaptation. Because in a world shaped by war, those who adapted lived longer. But adaptation has a cost. The longer a man survives inside war, the more his identity becomes inseparable from it. Courage is no longer a choice. Violence is no longer a question. And silence becomes unfamiliar. So when the fighting ended, what returned home was not the same person who had left. The war had stripped away complexity and replaced it with function. And now, without the war, that function had nowhere to exist. At home, strength was no longer enough. A man had to speak, to listen, to explain himself. He had to live with consequences that could not be blamed on the enemy. For many, this was harder than facing a battlefield, because war had taught them how to survive danger, but it had never taught them how to live without it. And so, for those who had lived long enough inside war, peace did not feel like an ending. It felt like standing in unfamiliar territory, without armor, without orders, and without the identity that had once kept them alive. Peace did not arrive as relief. It arrived as silence. No orders, no alarms, no clear enemy waiting at dawn. For those who had lived inside war, this silence was not comforting. It was disorienting, because peace did not explain itself. In war, life moved with urgency. Every decision mattered. Every action had immediate meaning. Danger gave direction. Fear had purpose, but peace offered none of that. Choices became slow. Consequences stretched far into the future. And responsibility could no longer be shared with commanders, with comrades, or with circumstance. There was no one left to obey, and no enemy left to blame. Only time and memory. Peace demanded a different kind of strength. Not the strength to endure pain, but the strength to remain still without feeling useless. Not the ability to strike, but the ability to speak, to explain oneself, to listen without reacting, to sit with uncertainty instead of cutting through it. For many, this was unfamiliar territory. War had taught them how to survive danger, but it had never taught them how to live without it. In war, fear was external. It came from beyond the walls, from across the battlefield, from something visible and definable. In peace, fear turned inward. It no longer announced itself. It lingered quietly, shapeless and unresolved. The past returned, not as memories of combat, but as unanswered questions. Who am I when no one needs me to fight? What value do I have when strength alone is no longer enough? And how do you belong to a world that no longer runs on survival? This is why peace felt fragile. Not because it was weak, but because it demanded transformation. War allowed men to remain unchanged. Peace required them to become someone else, to abandon the identity that had once kept them alive. And for those shaped by war, that kind of change was far more frightening than any enemy they had ever faced. This is why many did not rush home. Not because they were lost, but because they were afraid of what peace would ask of them once the fighting was truly over. And peace was patient. It did not demand answers immediately. It waited. Days passed, then weeks, then years. And in that waiting, many began to understand what truly frightened them. It was not the quiet itself. It was the freedom hidden inside it. Freedom to choose. Freedom to fail. Freedom to become responsible for every word spoken and every life touched. In war, identity was assigned. In peace, identity had to be built. And building something new meant admitting that the old self could no longer exist. For those shaped by war, that realization felt like loss. Not the loss of comrades, or even the loss of certainty, but the loss of a version of themselves that had once felt necessary. This is why peace felt incomplete. Not because the war still raged, but because the person who returned no longer knew how to belong to a world that no longer needed him to survive. And so, the fear of peace was never about the absence of violence. It was about facing a life that demanded more than survival alone. This is where the Odyssey truly begins, not as a tale of adventure, but as a story of delay. Because after Troy fell, the path home was not blocked. It was postponed again and again. Odysseus did not wander by accident. At every stage of his journey, there was always a choice to continue forward or to remain where he was. And time after time, he chose to remain. Each island offered something familiar. Not comfort, but avoidance. A place where responsibility could be deferred, where identity could be suspended, where peace did not yet demand transformation. The journey was not aimless. It was structured. A series of pauses, each one delaying the moment when Odysseus would have to return and become someone else. Home did not represent rest. Home represented reckoning. At home, he would no longer be a survivor among survivors. He would be a husband, a ruler, a man accountable for his actions in a world that was no longer shaped by war. And so the journey stretched on, not because the sea was endless, but because returning required more courage than continuing forward. The Odyssey is not about distance. It is about hesitation. It shows us a man who can endure monsters, storms, and loss, but who struggles most with the idea of standing still in a life that demands change. Every delay was a negotiation with the fear of peace. Every detour was an attempt to remain who he had been, rather than become who he needed to be. This is why the journey feels endless, because the real obstacle was never the sea. It was the moment when Odysseus would finally have to stop moving and face the life waiting for him on the shore. Delay is often mistaken for weakness, but in the Odyssey, delay is deliberate. Each pause is not the absence of will, but the presence of conflict. To move forward meant confronting a future that no longer fit the man he had become. To stay meant preserving a version of himself that still made sense. The journey allowed him to remain suspended between two identities. No longer a warrior bound by war, but not yet a man shaped by peace. At sea, there were no expectations. No one demanded explanations. No one required transformation. Time could pass without resolution, and in that suspended state, survival felt familiar. The islands did not trap him. They offered something far more dangerous. Permission. Permission to wait. Permission to postpone responsibility. Permission to believe that the moment of return could always happen later. But later has a cost, because the longer one delays change, the more frightening it becomes. The journey stretches not because the path is long, but because stopping requires acceptance. Acceptance that the war is over. Acceptance that the old self cannot be carried forward intact. This is why the Odyssey unfolds slowly. It mirrors the internal struggle of leaving behind a world where survival was enough and stepping into one where survival is no longer the measure of a man's worth. And so the sea becomes a space of avoidance, not a barrier, but a buffer, a place where movement replaces decision and distance delays reckoning. The Odyssey does not ask how far a man can travel. It asks how long he can avoid becoming someone new. The islands in the Odyssey are usually remembered as obstacles, interruptions along a difficult journey, delays caused by fate, temptation, or bad luck. But obstacles are meant to be resisted, and many of these islands were not resisted at all. They were entered, accepted, and in some cases quietly chosen. Because these islands did not function as traps, they functioned as shelters. Each one offered distance, not just from Ithaca, but from the moment of return itself. On these islands, Odysseus was temporarily released from the demands of home. He did not have to rule. He did not have to rebuild. He did not have to explain who he had become after the war. There were no laws to enforce, no expectations to meet, no future waiting to judge him. Time behaved differently there. Days blended into one another. Urgency faded. Responsibility lost its edge. And in that suspended state, survival felt familiar again. The islands did not promise happiness. They promised something quieter. Delay, a chance to remain undefined. At sea, movement could replace decision. As long as Odysseus was traveling, he did not have to arrive. And as long as he did not arrive, he did not have to change. This is why the journey does not feel direct. It circles, it pauses, it returns to variations of the same moment. Not because the path was confusing, but because the destination was demanding. Home was not dangerous. Home was permanent. At home, there would be no excuse to remain who he was, no war to justify distance, no chaos to absorb responsibility. Only the slow work of living in a world that no longer revolved around survival. The islands postponed that reckoning. Each one allowed Odysseus to continue being the man he knew how to be, just a little longer. Neither warrior nor king, neither lost nor returned, suspended between identities. This is why leaving the islands was so difficult. Not because they were hostile, but because they were gentle. They asked nothing. They did not demand growth. They did not insist on resolution. They allowed comfort without commitment. And comfort without commitment is one of the hardest things to walk away from. The Odyssey reveals something uncomfortable here, that people do not always avoid home because they are afraid of danger. They avoid it because they are afraid of stability, afraid of the long consequences that follow when survival is no longer the measure of worth. Each island became a negotiation with that fear. A silent question repeated again and again. Am I ready to stop moving? Am I ready to live without the momentum of war carrying me forward? The answer was never no, but it was rarely yes. So the journey continued, not endlessly, but deliberately, because delay is easier than refusal, and motion is easier than transformation. The islands were not mistakes. They were coping mechanisms, temporary solutions to a permanent change that could not be avoided forever. The Odyssey is not a story about being unable to go home. It is a story about learning how long a man can postpone becoming who peace requires him to be. The islands were never the enemy. They were places where fear could rest, places where the future could be postponed, places where return could be delayed until return no longer felt like loss. After everything Odysseus endured, it is tempting to believe that the hardest part of his journey was already behind him. The war, the sea, the losses. But none of those were the final trial. The final trial was home. Because home demanded something that no battlefield ever did. At Troy, identity was clear. Strength had purpose. Violence had direction. Loyalty was simple. Every decision existed inside a world shaped by necessity. But home was not shaped by necessity. It was shaped by memory, by expectation, by responsibility. At home, Odysseus could no longer move forward without consequence. Every word mattered. Every absence was noticed. Every mistake would echo. There were no enemies left to absorb blame, no chaos to hide behind. Only people who remembered who he had been and expected him to be that man again. But he was no longer that man. The war had changed him. The journey had changed him. And home did not offer instructions for who he was supposed to become next. This is why return required more courage than survival ever did. Because survival rewards endurance. Return demands accountability. At home, Odysseus would have to live without the clarity of danger, without the urgency of battle, without the permission to act first and explain later. He would have to choose restraint over reaction, presence over movement, patience over momentum. And unlike war, there would be no applause for this. No songs, no recognition. Only the quiet weight of being seen fully, without armor, without distance, and without excuse. This is why the homecoming is delayed. Not because the path was blocked, but because the self that returned was unprepared for the life waiting there. Home was not the reward. It was the reckoning. It was the place where every version of Odysseus would collide. The warrior, the survivor, the wanderer, and only one could remain. This is why in the Odyssey, the greatest test is not endurance, but restraint. Not strength, but presence. Not the ability to fight, but the ability to stay. Because facing the world after war is harder than surviving the war itself. And home is where that truth can no longer be delayed. The Odyssey is often remembered as a story about returning home, but seen this way, it becomes something quieter. A story about learning when movement must finally stop. Odysseus did not change because the journey ended. The journey ended because change could no longer be avoided. Home was never the destination. It was the moment when excuses ran out. The moment when survival was no longer enough to explain who a man was. This is why the story still endures. Because it is not really about ancient wars, or distant islands, or forgotten kings. It is about what happens after the struggle that defined us comes to an end. when the world no longer demands our endurance, but asks instead for presence. Many people recognize this moment without ever naming it. When a role ends, when a purpose fades, when movement continues but direction disappears. Like Odysseus, we delay. We find islands of distraction, shelters of routine, paths that keep us busy without forcing us to arrive. Because arriving means being seen, without armor, without distance, without the clarity of conflict to hide behind. The Odyssey does not tell us that this moment is easy. It tells us it is necessary, that the hardest journeys are not the ones that test our strength, but the ones that ask who we will become once strength is no longer required. Odysseus eventually returned, not because he was ready, but because there was nowhere left to delay becoming someone new. And perhaps that is the real ending. Not the moment he stepped into Ithaca, but the moment he accepted that staying would require more courage than wandering ever did. Because in the end, the greatest trial is not the road behind us, but the life that waits when we finally stop running. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on it. And if you'd like to see more documentaries that explore history through a deeper human lens, consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you for staying until the end. Your time matters, and I'll see you in the next story.